Hello, BookTube. We're continuing with our read-along today of Christopher Hitchens' book, God Is Not Great, his best-selling entry in the New Atheist sweepstakes from a decade ago. I'm doing this read-along with David Murphy, and I'll leave a link to his channel. And we are doing it in a slightly unconventional way. Instead of, glomming into the whole book at the end of the month or whatever, we're reading a chapter a day on the weekdays until we run out of chapters. And we're doing it, I think, for a couple of reasons. One was evident right from the start, which is that this is an extremely influential book. It's on the shelves of a million young people who don't have any other books, and it was a huge bestseller. That was the starting assumption that I think sort of justified this one chapter a day approach to the book. The other assumption grows once you start doing a chapter a day, which is that there is so much, what David refers to as dirty pool, there is so much careful, surgical cherry-picking going on here, and colored, skewed arguments, that you can't do them all justice in one video or two videos or even weekly videos. So we're doing a chapter a day, and yesterday was a bit of an anomaly. The third chapter of this book is basically a Jerry Seinfeld rant on how Judaism and Islam don't like pigs. Hitchens just sort of noticed that one day and decided to write 10 paragraphs on that subject. It's not very well informed. He tries at the end desperately to clothe it as a microcosm point of a larger picture. It fails. And it shouldn't be there, standing alone as a chapter. It seems rather weird. And especially since it comes after Chapter 2, which is all about politics and which is very skewed, but still very detailed and in a way knowledgeable. And it's sandwiched in between that chapter and the chapter we're doing today, which is Chapter 4, which is called a Note on Health. It's Religion is Bad for Your Health. A Note on Health, and the pretentious subtitle is To Which Religion Can Be Hazardous. And it also is long and detailed. It is extremely skewed and also messy. It's just very messy. 1 minute we're talking about the thesis of the theme of the chapter is the adversarial relationship that organized religion has to science and specifically medicine. And yet, we are often wandering into subjects. In the course of this chapter, we are often wandering into subjects that have nothing to do with either of those subjects. And that's to be expected. I don't think this was a particularly premeditated book, but the subject here, it should be said, is much stronger than any subject in this book that we've encountered so far. The second chapter of the book deals with religion killing. It deals with states killing for religious reasons and demonstrates almost no examples of that. Chapter 2 of this book shows more clearly than anything else that humans in aggregate will war on each other and oppress each other. It doesn't have much to say about religion, and the half of the examples that it brings up to prove that humans will do that in the name of religion proves just the opposite, that they will invoke religion to legitimize what they were going to do anyway, which means religion is not to blame. The main theme of that chapter was that religion moves governments to kill, and that was unconvincing. The main theme of Chapter 4, that organized religions tend to be in opposition to science and especially medicine, isn't really debatable. And when you get Hitchens on a point that isn't really debatable, a point on which he's on the right side and on which he's not debatable, he soars. And that is a wonderful thing to see. That is one of the reasons why it's possible to very much possible to enjoy this book. I want to read you an example of that. The attitude of religion to medicine, like the attitude of religion to science, is always necessarily problematic and very often necessarily hostile. Now, we'll leave out the rhetorical impossibility of something being very often necessarily anything. If it's necessarily, then it's always. But we'll leave that out. A modern believer can say and even believe that his faith is quite compatible with science and medicine. But the awkward fact will always be that both things have a tendency to break religion's monopoly and have often been fiercely resisted for that reason. What happens to the faith healer and shaman when any poor citizen can see the full effect of drugs and surgeries administered without ceremonies or mystifications? Roughly the same thing has happened to the rainmaker when the climatologist turns up, or the diviner from the heavens when school teachers get a hold of elementary telescopes. Plagues of antiquity were held to be punishments from the gods, which did much to strengthen the hold of the priesthood and much to encourage the burning of infidels and heretics who were thought, in an alternative explanation, to be spreading disease by witchcraft or else poisoning the wells. That's very good. And Hitchens goes on from there in this chapter to what a new reader to this book will by now see as his familiar MO, which is to raise the specter of an iniquity on the part of organized religion and then pick out half a dozen of the very worst examples to underscore that point while making vague hand-waving gestures that, it's not all Christians, or it's not all Muslims, when it's clearly meant to show that it is. And that opening statement, this throat-clearing here about religion being necessarily in conflict with science and medicine, is a perfect example of that. Almost all of the major scientific and medical advances before the modern era were made by religious people. There's obviously no ineradicable necessary conflict, and inevitably, in debates, for instance, for which he's now famous, if that point were brought to Hitchens' attention, usually the audience Q&A section happened at the end of the evening. Usually by then, Hitchens was visibly drunk. It's a scandal that you can see even now in lovingly curated YouTube clips made by his worshippers. You can see that he was insulting his host, his opponent, and his audience enough to drink liquor while he was having his debate, so that by the time he got to the questions and answers, he was not, let's say, at his strongest. And invariably, when someone in the audience would get up and say, well, you say that science and medicine are in, essential conflict with organized religion, and yet most of the major discoveries that were conducted in science and religion throughout the history of both those disciplines were done by religious people who never lost their faith to do it and whose discoveries were not discouraged by their faith. So that seems to make your point wrong. Invariably, Hitchens would do a trick that he does throughout this book. We haven't quite seen it yet. It's raised its head a couple of times. It becomes much more flagrant in later chapters. Invariably, he would do the same trick over and over again, which is to say they weren't really religious. He constructed an argument here, a context for his opposition to organized religion, very knowingly. He constructed it in such a way that it could not be falsified, that he could simply dictate the terms and stretch them to fit anything, to fit any objection at all. The most famous example being when questioners would say, well, you attribute religion to all these atrocities, and yet didn't Stalin commit massive atrocities in the Soviet Union when he was an atheist and also mandated that the Soviet Union be atheist? That was the most famous example of Hitchens' gotcha that he simply refused to admit exists. Said, no. The Soviet Union was religious in all but name. Lysenko's biology was miracles. I'm saying that it was. But that happens in this chapter as well, that kind of cherry picking. The examples that he brings forth are extremely powerful. The Roman Catholic Church, for instance, has a lot of blood on its hands when it comes to its reaction in the 20th century to medical advances. In the 19th century, in other words, in the light of the modern scientific method, the Roman Catholic Church, especially certain very vocal, virulent strands of Roman Catholicism, has been in opposition to, for instance, the use of condoms, the use of birth control, even when those things are being used in the fight against a scourge like AIDS. And Hitchens invariably, like a pig hunting truffles, he finds every one of those examples and lists them all for the reader, and they are all horrifying. They are all horrifying. This is a chapter full of horrors. And he mentions at one point, the problem that I have with it, is the main problem that I have with this, is that it is, as usual, like so many other chapters in this book, it is silent on the religious examples to the contrary. And that always bugs me. when Hitchens does it or when anybody else does it. In Hitchens' case, I believe it's born of ignorance, and I don't think anyone ever had the courage to say that to his face. I think it's just that he went looking for the egregious examples of the horror show that he includes in this chapter, and didn't bother to go looking for the examples to the contrary. The countless religious clerics, if we stick to, the AD, if we stick to the so-called modern era, countless religious clerics, Islamic clerics, Christian clerics, countless of them, willingly going into viral zones, into plague zones, into sick zones, to minister to the sick, who had no hope of survival, and who had a very high likelihood of infecting them. Secular people, the few secular people who existed in any of those environments, very much did not do that. Instead, like the noblemen in the Decameron, they packed up and left town. It was the religious who did that, exclusively. And they didn't bang a drum about it, and they didn't write manifestos about it, and they went to, as Hitchens, he invokes George Eliot again in this chapter with quiet, unvisited graves. Okay, well, hundreds of thousands of devotedly religious people went to those quiet, untented graves, having given the boon of mercy to the sick and the dying, for no hope of remuneration and with no hope of helping them. This is long before medicine, long before these people weren't doctors. They weren't going there to try and help. They were going there only because their holy doctrines told them to be merciful. Show mercy, not just to your own friends and your own relatives and your own backers. Show mercy to everyone, and not just when it's convenient for you or safe for you. Show it all the time. Go and show mercy all the time. There are injunctions to that effect all throughout the Quran, all throughout the Bible, and religious people throughout the centuries have taken those injunctions very seriously, selflessly. And Hitchens refuses to admit it. He won't admit anywhere in the chapter that so much of the bedrock of modern science, modern medicine, modern inquiry, you name it, astronomy, geology, you name it, even the theory of evolution by means of natural selection. He won't acknowledge anywhere in the chapter that so much of that is based on holy orders. It is that so much of it came from holy orders. And if you were to confront him on it, he would say, well, that was where the research was, that was where the money was, that was where the schools were. We don't know what was in their heart. But he's perfectly willing to diagnose what's in the heart of the people that he lists who are doing horrible things. In point of fact, we do know what's in the heart of someone who professes in their journal or before their congregation that they are about to enter a plague zone to minister to the dying in the name of Jesus Christ, because Jesus wishes them to do it, and that they don't expect to come back to their congregation or to their family. We have many, many accounts like that, and there is no reason to doubt the sincerity of those beliefs at all. And that still happens. In another part of my YouTube channel, we are doing a read-along of the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant the Unbeliever, who is a leper, and who goes to a leprosarium to meet other lepers in the 20th century, in the modern day. And what you have to remember, what should come to your mind in a situation like that, is how many times lepers appear in the New Testament, and who tended to them, who tended to the leper colonies for all throughout the Middle Ages, for the centuries of the Middle Ages. Who tended to those people? Who gave them the small amount of dignity they could expect to get anywhere? The religious did. The religious did. In tiny towns and walled villages all throughout France and Poland, all throughout northern Spain, in the very worst ages of what we call the Dark Ages, the very worst times, do you think there were Doctors Without Borders? Do you think there was UNICEF? No, there was not. What happened in those towns, in those ages, if a woman lost her husband and had 3 children? The religious stepped forward and took care of her in 99% of all cases. Of course, if you left those documents open to Hitchens, he would sniff out the case where the widow and her children were banished from town, or she was forced to marry another man, or something like that. The more historically literate you get, the more you realize that those were egregious, barbaric exceptions condemned at the time by everyone except the people who were doing them. But by far, 99% of the time, the example was that the religious community around that woman and her children would take her in, would show her mercy, because it had been enjoined on them by their Savior or by their prophet. And that is nowhere to be found in God Is Not Great, and that drives me nuts about this book. This chapter is more spot on than most. Religions tend to retard, organized religions, especially the loudest and most insecure male votaries of those religions, people, men who have positions of power, tend to retard the spread of medicine in their community. They tend to throw the emphasis back on prayer, back on holy shrines, that sort of thing. And those people deserve the riposte that they get from, for instance, to the 21st century crop of new atheists, or even the great atheists of the 20th century, from Robert Ingersoll on, who would say, well, if you want to impress me about the holy shrine, for instance, at Lourdes, that has a mound of crutches outside. When visitors go to visit, there's a mound of crutches designed to impart to visitors that these people have been healed. And naysayers, new atheists, old atheists, even religious people, who would see that, always had the same riposte, which was, if you want to impress me, show me a mound of artificial legs that have been left behind, because their leg has been regrown. There aren't any. And there isn't ever any. Faith healing and stuff like that. It's a racket. Hitchens is right to come down. He's right to come down on it. He's right to condemn the offenses that are all throughout this chapter. And it makes for invigorating reading. The only problem that I have with it is that it's cherry-picked. And if it were a sound argument instead of a polemic, it wouldn't need to be. And that is basically all I have to say about Chapter 4. I'm sure you'll get a lot more detail from David, but the neat thing about this read-along is that we're not coordinating with each other ahead of time, so I don't actually know what he'll say about Chapter 4. It is full of detail, full of black marks on the record of organized religion, mainly three. It's mainly the Abrahamic religions that Hitchens is talking about in the course of this book. He doesn't know anything about earlier religions than that, and also he has the three Abrahamic religions exactly where he wants them. Those are the three major religions in the West that had to deal with the rise of science. Most of the religions, all of the religions before then, did not. It was that and nothing else. There was scarcely a medical profession to speak of, and scarcely any science. So there was, for the 10,000 years before Judaism, Hitchens has no interest in that because there's no dichotomy to draw on. There's no winning side. So it's mainly those three Abrahamic religions in this chapter. And it makes for doleful reading, but it's powerful. It's a mess of a chapter. It wanders all over the place. All sorts of things that are not science or medicine are brought in just because Hitchens feels like riffing on them and could not be edited. But it's a stronger chapter anyway than Chapter 3, and stronger than the first chapter in the book, in my opinion. So we're going to move on next time. Tomorrow is Friday, so you get your last chapter of the week on Friday. Then you get a Hitchens break for the weekend. And we're going to Chapter 5, which is the metaphysical claims of religion are false. That's the title of the chapter. And we will see what we will see. So I will reconvene with this tomorrow. Thank you, Book 2.